I never thought my life would take such an unexpected and passionate turn at 40. I, Sarah, a seemingly happily married woman in a small rural town, was about to embark on an adventure that would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and desire. My husband Tom was a hard-working and dedicated man. He spent long periods away from home due to his job, leaving me alone in our modest country house. Although I appreciated his effort and dedication, I couldn't help feeling lonely and forgotten. The days passed monotonously, without emotions, without spark. Everything changed the day my nephew Jason arrived at our door. Having just turned 20, he was the very image of youth and vitality. His bright eyes and carefree smile reminded me of a younger version of myself, before routine and responsibilities dimmed my spirit. Jason temporarily moved in with us while looking for work in the city. His presence brought a breath of fresh air to my stagnant life. I found myself eager to get up every morning, excited for the conversations we would have over breakfast. His energy was contagious, and little by little, I felt a dormant part of me beginning to awaken. At first, I told myself it was normal to feel this way. After all, Jason was family, and his company simply filled the void Tom left with his constant absences. But soon I realized my feelings went beyond simple family affection. I began to notice details I would have overlooked before. The way his muscles tensed when he helped with household chores, the scent of his cologne as he passed by me, the warmth of his smile when our eyes met. I felt guilty for these thoughts, but I couldn't help them. What I didn't know was that Jason was also struggling with his own forbidden feelings. Later, he would confess to me that from the first moment he saw me, he felt an attraction that scared and excited him. In equal parts, I was his aunt, his uncle's wife. But I was also a beautiful, mature woman who awakened desires in him that he had never experienced before. The days passed, and the tension between us grew. Every accidental brush, every gaze held a second longer than necessary. Every whispered conversation in the kitchen while Tom slept all built an emotional house of cards that threatened to collapse at any moment. It was on a particularly hot afternoon when everything changed. The heat was stifling, and I decided to take a bath to cool off. As I undressed in the bathroom, I heard a creak in the hallway. My heart raced, instinctively knowing it was Jason. For a moment, I stood motionless, my hand on the doorknob. I knew I should close it, secure it, maintain this physical barrier between us. But something inside me, a voice I had ignored for too long, whispered to leave it ajar. The sound of the shower filled the bathroom, mixing with the beating of my heart in my ears. I closed my eyes and let the hot water run over my body, imagining it was Jason's hands caressing me. It was then that I heard the door slowly open. I opened my eyes, and there he was, standing on the threshold, with a mixture of desire and guilt in his gaze. Our eyes met, and at that moment I knew there was no turning back. "Jason," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the water. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. He understood the implicit invitation in my tone, in the way my body tensed in anticipation. In an instant, Jason was beside me in the shower, fully clothed, the water soaking his clothes. His hands found my waist, and I felt my skin burn under his touch. Our lips met in a passionate kiss, years of repressed desire exploding in a moment of madness and ecstasy. Jason's hands explored every inch of my body, awakening sensations I thought forgotten. I, in turn, slid my fingers across his chest, feeling the tense muscles under the wet fabric. Slowly, I rid him of his clothes, letting them fall to the shower floor with a dull thud. Our naked bodies intertwined under the hot water, the steam enveloping our forbidden act like a veil of secrecy. Every caress, every kiss, every thrust took us further from the outside world, deeper into our own universe of pleasure and sin. When we finally reached climax, it was as if a wave of guilt and satisfaction hit us simultaneously. We stayed embraced under the water, panting, not daring to look into each other's eyes for fear of what we might see reflected in them. That afternoon marked the beginning of our secret romance. Each day was a game of furtive glances, accidental touches, and stolen encounters. We learned the art of stealth, turning every corner of the house into a potential hiding place for our passionate meetings. Guilt gnawed at us, especially when Tom was home. Seeing him sitting at the table, oblivious to the betrayal occurring under his own roof, was torture. But remorse only seemed to fuel our passion, making each encounter more intense, more desperate. Jason and I became experts in deception. We learned to communicate silently. With just a look, we could agree on the place and time of our next encounter. We developed a secret language of gestures and seemingly innocent phrases that only we understood. There were moments when I was on the verge of confessing everything I saw: the kindness in Tom's eyes, his unconditional love for me, and I felt like the most despicable being in the world. But then Jason would look at me from across the room, and everything else would fade away. One day, while Tom was on one of his work trips, Jason and I decided to risk even more. We left town on his motorcycle, heading to a small hidden lake in the forest. It was a place Tom and I used to frequent in our early years of marriage, which added an extra layer of guilt to our adventure. Lying on a blanket by the water, our bodies intertwined and glistening with sweat, Jason looked at me with an intensity that took my breath away. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered, his words falling like bombs on my conscience. "I want us to leave all this behind. Let's run away together, start a new life far from here." His proposal left me speechless. Part of me wanted to scream, "Yes," and throw myself into his arms, leaving behind all the guilt and deception. But another part, the rational part I had been trying to ignore for weeks, reminded me of all the reasons why this was madness. "Jason," I began, my voice trembling, "what we have, this thing between us, it's beautiful and passionate, but it's not real. We can't build a life on lies and betrayal." I saw the pain in his eyes, but also a flash of understanding. We both knew that what we had was a fantasy, an escape from our everyday lives. But was that enough to justify the harm we were causing? That night, as I lay in the bed I shared with Tom, I made a decision: I had to end this madness before it destroyed us all. But how to do it without breaking the hearts of the people I loved? The following days were agony. Every time I saw Jason, every time our eyes met across the breakfast table, I felt my resolution faltering, but I stood firm. I began to avoid being alone with him, inventing excuses to keep my distance. Jason noticed the change. Of course, I saw it in the way. His eyes followed me with a mixture of confusion and pain. I wanted to explain, to tell him this was best for both of us. But I feared that if I opened my mouth, all my defenses would crumble. It was during this period of distancing that Tom announced he would have to be away for a month due to an important project at work. The news fell like a bucket of cold water on me. A month alone with Jason, with all this unresolved tension between us, seemed like a recipe for disaster. The night before Tom left, as he packed his suitcase, I felt an irresistible urge to confess everything. The words were on the tip of my tongue, ready to come out and destroy the peace of our home. But when I saw the trust and love in his eyes, I couldn't do it. Instead, I hugged him tightly, promising myself that I would use this month to sort out my feelings and make a definitive decision. The first days after Tom's departure were tense. Jason and I moved around the house like ghosts, avoiding each other, speaking only when necessary. I could feel his gaze following me, full of unasked questions and repressed desire. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat in the kitchen, waiting for Jason to appear for our usual silent dinner. When he entered and saw me, he stopped short, as if he sensed something important was about to happen. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I felt inside. Jason sat across from me, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know," he simply replied. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told him about my conflicting feelings, about the love I felt for him, but also for Tom. I talked about the guilt that consumed me, the fear of losing everything. And finally, I told him we couldn't go on like this. Jason listened in silence, his eyes filling with tears. As I spoke, when I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I love you, Sarah," he said, his voice broken with emotion. "But I understand what we've been doing. It's not right for any of us." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't expected Jason to understand so easily, and his maturity surprised me and filled me with a new kind of love for him. We decided to use the month ahead to heal, to redefine our relationship, and find a way to move forward without destroying each other. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the temptation to fall back into our old habits was almost irresistible, but we stayed strong, supporting each other in our decision. As the days passed, I discovered a new facet of Jason. He was no longer just the passionate young man who had awakened my desire, but a mature man capable of making difficult decisions for the good of all. Our relationship transformed into something different, deeper and more meaningful than the lust that had initially united us. When Tom returned a month later, he found a different house. The tension that had permeated the air for weeks had dissipated. In its place was a new harmony, a peace we hadn't experienced in a long time. Jason announced that he had found work in the city and would be moving soon. Tom was delighted with the news, proud that his nephew was finally getting his life on track. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness, knowing it was for the best but fearing the void his departure would leave. The night before Jason left, the three of us had dinner together. It was a bittersweet evening, full of laughter and shared memories. When Tom retired to bed, Jason and I were left alone in the kitchen, washing dishes in comfortable silence. "Thank you," Jason suddenly said, his voice barely a whisper. I looked at him, confused. "For what?" "For teaching me what true love is," he replied, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "Not just passion and desire, but the sacrifice and maturity it entails." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Oh, Jason," I whispered, "I should be thanking you. You reminded me that I'm still capable of feeling, of loving intensely. You gave me back a part of myself I thought was lost." We hugged, a long and heartfelt embrace, but no longer charged with forbidden desire. It was a farewell hug, of gratitude, of a love that had evolved beyond the physical. The next morning Jason left. I watched him ride away on his motorcycle, taking a part of my heart with him, but leaving me more complete than I had been in years. In the months that followed, my relationship with Tom blossomed in a way I hadn't expected. I rediscovered the love I felt for him, a mature and deep love that had been there all along, waiting to be rekindled. Our intimacy was renewed, fueled by the spark Jason had ignited in me. Jason visited us occasionally, bringing news of his new life in the city. Every time I saw him, I felt a pang of what could have been, but it was no longer painful. Instead, I felt a deep gratitude for the lesson our affair had taught us. A year after Jason moved out, we received an invitation to his wedding. He had fallen in love with a young woman in the city, and his happiness was evident in every word of the invitation. Tom was delighted, eager to see his nephew take this important step in his life. I, for my part, felt a mix of emotions. I was happy, for Jason, genuinely happy that he had found the love and stability he deserved. But I also felt a twinge of nostalgia, an echo of the what if that would never completely fade. The day of the wedding arrived, and Tom and I headed to the city. When I saw Jason waiting at the altar, so handsome in his groom's suit, my heart skipped a beat. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw in them a reflection of my own feelings. Love, gratitude, and a hint of melancholy for what could never be. The ceremony was beautiful, full of love and promises of a bright future. As I watched Jason and his new wife exchange vows, I felt a chapter of my life definitively closing. I was no longer the woman who had succumbed to temptation in that bathroom. So, long ago, I was a stronger, wiser woman who had learned valuable lessons about love, loyalty, and forgiveness. During the reception, Jason approached us. He hugged Tom affectionately, thanking him for all his support over the years. Then he turned to me, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. "Aunt Sarah," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot to me that you're here." I hugged him, allowing myself for a brief instant to remember the passion we once shared. But when we parted, I saw in his eyes that he too had closed that chapter. We were different, people now, mature and at peace with our decisions. "We're family," I replied with a sincere smile. "We'll always be here for you." That night, back in our hotel room, Tom held me tightly. "It's been a beautiful day," he murmured, half asleep. "Yes, it has," I replied, snuggling closer to him. As I lay there, listening to my husband's soft breathing, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The affair with Jason, though brief and tumultuous, had been a catalyst for growth and change in my life. It had forced me to face truths about myself that I had been avoiding for years. I understood that true love isn't always easy or comfortable. Sometimes it challenges us, pushes us to our limits, and forces us to make difficult decisions. But in the end, it makes us stronger, more compassionate, and more aware of who we really are. My relationship with Tom had changed, deepening in a way that wouldn't have been possible without the shake-up that Jason brought to our lives. We had rediscovered passion and intimacy, but we had also developed a new appreciation for the trust and loyalty that bound us together. As for Jason, he would always hold a special place in my heart. Our brief romance had been like an intense flame. It burned brightly, illuminated dark corners of our souls, but inevitably extinguished. However, the embers of that fire would continue to warm us, reminding us of the human heart's capacity to love, forgive, and grow. The next morning, as Tom and I packed to return home, I paused for a moment in front of the mirror. The woman who looked back at me wasn't the same one who had arrived in the city the day before. There was a new serenity in her eyes, an acceptance of all parts of herself, even those that once shamed. I took Tom's hand, and we left the room, ready to face whatever the future held for us. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and temptation. But I also knew that I was equipped to handle them with grace and strength. As we drove back to our small town, I looked out the window, watching the landscape pass by. Every mile we travelled took me further from the woman I had been and closer to the woman I was meant to be, a woman who had loved intensely, who had made mistakes, but who had found the courage to face them and grow from them. The sun was setting on the horizon, bathing the world in golden and pink hues. It was a new dawn, not just for the day, but for my life. I closed my eyes, grateful for the journey that had brought me here, and excited for what the future might bring. That night, back in our house, Tom and I sat on the porch, enjoying the tranquility of the countryside. I took his hand in mine, feeling the warmth and familiarity of his touch. "I love you," I told him, the words carrying a new weight and meaning. Tom looked at me, his eyes shining with love and understanding. "I love you too, Sarah, always." And at that moment I knew everything would be all right. Love, in all its complicated and beautiful forms, had carried us through the storm and brought us to a place of peace and acceptance. Life would go on, with its ups and downs, its moments of joy and sadness. But now I was ready to face it with an open and honest heart, knowing that true love, whether passionate or constant, always finds its way. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, I thought of Jason, of Tom, of the woman I had been and the one I had become. Each of them had played a crucial role in my journey, teaching me invaluable lessons about love, loyalty, and forgiveness. The wind whispered through the trees, bringing with it the scent of wildflowers and promises of new beginnings. I closed my eyes, grateful for everything I had experienced, for everything I had learned. This was my story, a story of love in all its complicated and beautiful forms. A story of betrayal and redemption, of passion and maturity, of loss and gain. And although it had come to an end, I knew that in many ways it was just beginning. Because love, true love, never really ends. It transforms, evolves, challenges us, and changes us. And in the end, it makes us stronger, wiser, and more capable of loving again. As Tom and I retired to our bedroom that night, I felt a deep peace settle in my heart. I had gone through the fire of passion and guilt, and had emerged transformed, ready to love more deeply, more honestly, and more completely than ever before. And so, with one last glance at the stars shining over our small town, I closed this chapter of my life, grateful for every moment, every tear, and every smile that had brought me here. Because in the end, isn't that what life is all about? Loving, learning, forgiving and growing, finding beauty even in our mistakes and strength in our weaknesses. This was my story. A story of love in all its complicated and wonderful forms, and though this part had come to an end, I knew that our journey was just beginning.